This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I am speaking with Travis Mills. He is the founder and CEO of Running Wild Films, an independent film production company in Arizona, and I'll be talking with him about his company and the indie film scene in America. As mentioned, my guest is Travis Mills. He runs Running Wild Films. It's based in Arizona, and it's an independent film production company. If I could just ask Travis to take a few minutes, give a little background about himself, where he came from, how he got into filmmaking, and why he decided to form an independent film production company. So, Travis, welcome, and if you could just start us off with that.
Thank you, Dan. I've been in Arizona since 1997. Before that, I actually grew up in a place called the Comoro Islands overseas. It's in between Madagascar and the continent of Africa. I was raised by missionaries. I come from that background. I was born in Ecuador. And then I've spent, the latter part of my life so far in Arizona. And I've always been obsessed with film. I went to film school, which wasn't necessarily a totally positive experience, but I met someone at film school, a professor who retired soon after I graduated, Gus Edwards. We started the company, Running Wild Films, in 2010 with the idea to stay in Arizona, develop a local an indigenous film movement here and not go to LA. So that's the gist of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I come from a writing background, and my website's been up for about 15 years, and I've railed often against MFA creative writing programs, the sort of Henry Ford assembly line production aspect to that. And I know that I think Hollywood with films, pop music, television, cable, even I see it on YouTube channels. There seems to be this lowest common denominator impulse. For example, I've done now, I think, my 118th interview. And most of these interviews run from 60 minutes to sometimes 3 hours, talking with actors. Recently I started, philosophers, theologians. And, I may in 6 months get a couple of hundred views. Whereas if, someone does an Albert Einstein cartoon dressed as a chipmunk talking about E equals MC squared, they'll get 1 million hits in, 2 weeks. Is that one of the frustrations that you've had with film today, not just indie film, but American film, that there's always this lowest common denominator? We just have to churn, it's called content production now online, that people just want to produce content, but nothing of quality.
Yeah, obviously it's not necessarily quality that does very well on YouTube, and it's very difficult to get so-called serious work viewed. We made a short film called Table Affair a couple years ago, which has skyrocketed to be our #1 video on YouTube. It is a serious piece of work, and creative and experimental. But the only reason that it skyrocketed is that it touches on, I think, foot fetishes. So you know what I mean? And that's the irony, is that we created this thing, and when we first released it, it got like 100 views, like some of your interviews. But now it's at 3 million, something, and it had nothing to do with our audience base.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's difficult, but I was, that's not the reason that we started Running Wild. We were frustrated, I think, with a few ideas. One, that you have to go to New York or LA to make it, which I think is not true. And that it's changing, and that the internet is a big part of why it's changing. Also, frustrated with sort of these inflated budgets and certain preconceptions that we were given in film school of the way you had to make a movie and how much it had to be made for, how long it had to take. So that's kind of where this all came from.
Yeah, in your website, you mention that obstacles are something that you try to overcome, like limited budgets. And I know a number of the early filmmakers, especially those on B films, and I recently did a show on B films in Hollywood, were given X amount of budget and they just had to make do. I did an interview. In fact, I found out about your film company a year or so ago when I interviewed another Arizona filmmaker named Michael Jason Allen. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's done two or three low budget films. He did a film for $5,000 called The Coldest Kiss, which was actually a pretty good film. And it looks with the technology, it looks like a film that isn't necessarily, the low budget films we think of from the 60s or 70s kind of thing. What is one of the things that you strive for in the films? I think John Huston said that all great films start with a great screenplay. Is that what you look for first?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say great screenplay. I'd say great story.
Yeah.
It has to have a good story, and everything on top of that is going to help that story. But you don't doesn't necessarily have to look beautiful to be a good film. It needs a good solid story, and it needs actors that serve that story. If they don't serve it well, however talented or not talented they are, then it falls apart.
Yeah, speaking of good stories, I had mentioned just before we started that I had been watching a number of your 52 films in 52 weeks, which I guess was something you did a couple of years ago. And most of them are famed short stories, mostly American, but some other foreigners like Guy de Maupassant and James Joyce and whatnot. What was the impetus for that? And is that can you make money on short films these days, or is that something that basically acts as de facto advertisements for your feature films?
Right. Unfortunately, short films are not really. It's hard to monetize short films, and that's one of the reasons that they aren't made. You don't see a lot of mainstream filmmakers going back to make short films, which is a shame. You know what I mean? I wish that wasn't the case. You can make some money off of them on YouTube, Vimeo, and through festivals, but that's a long shot. Most people use short films as a stepping stone. I keep going back to shorts because I like the form, and I see it as being no different than someone writing a novel and then writing short stories, which a great writer like John O'Hara did, right? So I think it's a very good form that people should use more often and take seriously, not just as a stepping stone. The reason that I chose those stories for that 52 series is that I've always been inspired by literature since I was in high school. Some of these stories I read for the first time when I was in high school and again in college. I think I learned more about storytelling and filmmaking in my literature classes at ASU than I did in my film classes. So they're a great, there's a reason they're classics. They're a great base to jump off from. When you watch some of the films and read the stories, you might not even see the connection, but that's the point with adaptation, I think, is that I was inspired by these sources and then tried to do something new with them.
Yeah, I know. I've done poems, what are called ekphrastic poems, where if I'm looking at, say, a painting and I write a poem about it, you don't want to recapitulate the painting. You want to use that as a starting off point. And some of your short films could probably be called ekphrastic films based upon the short stories that they're set in a different time. I think your James Joyce one, The Dead one, is set in America, and people don't have the Irish accents, but it has some of the qualities of that little novella.
Right. All of them are supposed to be set in Arizona, whether they feel that way or not. Modern day Arizona. And some of them have more that feeling than others. But yeah, I thought it would be a challenge, especially with the Joyce stories, because I did all of Dubliners, all 15 stories from Dubliners,
Yeah.
which I think is probably one of the greatest books ever written.
Yeah.
And the challenge to take something that is, one, very Irish, and two, in some ways very much of its time, but I also think transcends its time, and put it in modern day Arizona was a big challenge.
Yeah, you talked about stories. I've often said that I also agree that I think filmmaking has more to owed to literature than photography. It's called motion pictures, meaning that motion or the narrative comes before the pictures. That's not to say that you can't have pure cinema. I mean, you can look at some of the works of an Antonioni. You can look at some of the great world filmmakers that tend to be a little bit less devoted to plot heavy stuff that America does, and you can see them using it. And I think of like 2001: A Space Odyssey. A lot of people say, well, it's dull, it doesn't have a screenplay. Well, I'm like, no, it just doesn't have a conventional screenplay. What do
Right.
you look for when you get a screenplay? And can a director, let's say, can a director come to you and say, look, I have this idea for a film. Do you have just in-house directors, or can someone else come to you with an idea?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, to touch on what you said, I do agree that obviously the importance of story, and I do appreciate pure cinema, as you mentioned it, whether it's Kubrick or Bresson or Antonioni. And I think that what a lot of people making movies don't do is explore cinema and realize how much there is to do within the medium.
Yeah.
They're very, they've only seen Jurassic World and Captain America,
Right.
so they only know one way. I'm not even commenting on blockbusters. They only know one storytelling way. But if you expand and you start to watch silent cinema and just really explore the history of movies, then you learn, wow, I could actually do something like this or that. So I think that's an important thing to do, and I've tried to experiment with different forms. In terms of people bringing us ideas, the problem is everyone has an idea for a movie,
Yeah.
and this becomes more and more clear the more films we make and earn some level of notoriety for our films. We get people coming to us with scripts or with ideas, and I think that the idea the general public has is that any filmmaker would love for someone on the street to come up to them with this brilliant inspirational idea. What they don't realize is that I think most of us, we have 1,000 ideas that we can't get done
Yeah.
at the time that we have, and that doesn't mean I'm not open to other stories, because I absolutely am. But I always ask these people who bring me something, I say, okay, well, what are you willing to put in to make sure that this gets made? Are you going to put the same time and effort and maybe even money into it that I'm going to put in? And if the answer is no, then I don't care how brilliant your idea is. I'd rather work on my less brilliant idea. So it's kind of it's a difficult situation, but we just have so many projects brewing that it's hard to take on anything else unless that person is really willing to take the same risks that we do.
And how does a company like yours make money, get financial backing? Because I know I interviewed a fellow who does these fan fiction Star Trek episodes, and I've known a number of people who made small independent films. There was a fellow that I got, because I often get asked to review films, and most of them are, the Caucasaurus conquers Fayetteville or something, these ridiculous horror films. But on occasion, I get some interesting stuff, and I try to review it. Can you actually make money, or is this a vocation? Do you have a day job?
I decided back in 2011, right after we made our first feature film called The Big Something, I was working a day job, and basically an opportunity presented itself for me to go full time or to continue working that job. And I said, I'm going to be a full time filmmaker, and I'm never looking back, regardless of how hard it is or how I have to live. And I haven't since then. And I think that however scary it is, I think you have to do that as a filmmaker. And you just have to, kind of jump off the ledge. Werner Herzog has an analogy that he uses that, to be a filmmaker, you have to jump off this skyscraper. You have to take that leap of faith,
Yeah.
And that's what you have to do. So in terms of money, it's very difficult to do what we're doing and make money. We make very little money at this point on our films, and most of it that we do make goes right back into the films. And I think that's how it has to be.
Hmm.
And we just do whatever we can to survive, to be honest. And every once in a while we get a little payday on something, but it's definitely a very sort of crazy life to live. And I think it's the reason, a few things. One, it's the reason that anyone who has a family and is supporting a family and likes stability is going to struggle being a full-time filmmaker, full-time independent filmmaker. I think doesn't mean it's not possible, but they're going to struggle. And also, this kind of thing that I'm doing would not be possible in New York or LA, I
Yeah.
believe, because I'd be the cost of living is too high.
Yeah.
But in Arizona, I can pull it off.
Yeah, I've said this to many young artists too. I just got an email the last week or so from a young writer, and my advice is saying, if you want to be good at something, you cannot be great at something part time. You have to put that as the primary thing in your life. That may mean that, you're not going to have the white picket fence and whatnot, and family. Let me just ask about, because I see listed on your site that you and Gus Edwards are directors. Do you co-direct with him, or do you each have a couple of projects that you're working on?
We've co-directed once on a project that we shot a couple years ago that we're still piecing together called Black Heroes. But mostly we work separately. Gus is definitely my mentor and my friend, and he helps me make decisions with the company. He reads all of the scripts that we produce. He looks at the work when it's put together. And he has his own projects, one that I acted in earlier this year, that he does here and there. So we don't, I don't really believe in co-direction, with rare exceptions. Usually it needs to be one captain of the ship.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult to co-direct with someone. But, with the right project, it can work.
Now, I know one of the things that caught my eye in just reading about both on your website and things about your website and your company, you are not high on the independent film festival circuit, at least here in the U.S., maybe worldwide as well. And I know a lot of people, when they write about, oh, the Hollywood scene sucks and whatnot, they'll often point to independent film festivals. And it's similar in the writing world that people talk about independent presses versus the New York presses. But you seem to have some legitimate gripes about the system. I know Robert Redford gets a lot of kudos for having started Sundance Film Festival, and now they sort of sprouted up maybe a couple of dozen major festivals here, the Tribeca Festival in New York. What is your the main thing that you have against them? Do you think that they just really are just sort of pseudo indie promoters, that they're more interested in funding themselves as festivals rather than getting behind, filmmaking that's quality?
Well, I think it's important to remember that even Redford, I believe, said that Sundance has become this totally different animal than he originally intended it to be, which I believe is one of the reasons that he sold it off. He's still associated with it, but it started out with the intention of showcasing truly independent films, and now the movies that play there, I would question whether a good amount of them are independent. Um, so my main, I can't assume. I'm sure there's a lot of great people working in the festival system with good intentions, but I just think that the system is corrupt. When you have these festivals that start up everywhere, and you pay to submit to the festival with no guarantee that your film even gets watched. I think that's one of my main things. Why am I paying $50 to $100 to submit my film to your festival if I don't? I don't even. I'm trusting you that it doesn't end up in just a stack of movies. Even then, does it get watched thoroughly or by someone who's really paying attention? I think that the festivals should pay the filmmakers. You know, I've been able to play my movies in theaters around the country and make some money off of them outside of the festival circuit without a distributor. And I think that's what filmmakers should be doing more. So yeah, I have some serious issues with the festival circuit. Obviously it works for some people. Obviously some careers take off from it. I think that the problem is a lot of young filmmakers have stars in their eyes when it comes to festivals, waste a lot of money and time when they should just be getting their work out there.
I know before ebooks came along and Amazon presses and a handful of others online, there were things called vanity presses. Would you say where you'd pay X amount to publish your great thesis or great novel or great whatever? Uh, do you think that, in a sense, that's sort of what the festival systems have become? That they are basically, for example, I mentioned I was against writing programs, and I'm like, these creative writing programs, even if you get an Emily Dickinson, she's going to be Emily Dickinson going in. You can't make gold out of crap. And when your main idea is to just get people to pay and to go be taught by people who, if they were great writers themselves, probably would not be working in some community college. Is there, you mentioned that it's sort of a scam. Is that the basic thing that you have against it, that there's no accountability, there's no sort of uh, credibility to who's looking at this, what qualifications do they have, do they know what they're talking about, and is money the primary object for these festivals?
It seems to be that money is the primary object, even if the intention started well. Again, I can't assume what every festival director and programmer's true intentions are. But yeah, who are these people? How are they judging what's getting in? Is it really a qualitative competition? You know, I think that a lot of the industry is about vanity and glamour, and that's really the opposite of what real filmmaking is, which is hard work and uh, creating entertainment, creating a product. I do believe that it's a product. Um, but even when you look at something like the Oscars, it's not about the best film, and it's not even about celebrating cinema. It's about patting each other on the back and vanity and glamour and look at us. It's not about the real hard work. Um, we equate ourselves more with craftsmen, someone like a carpenter who is making a chair, and then that chair is done, or a table, and then it's sold, and it's put out there for people to use. And that's why we have hundreds of videos on YouTube, because I make them, I put them out there, people can see them, and then I move on and I make something else. I don't make a short film and then sit for 2 years to see if it can win a prize at a film festival. That's not what we're about.
Yeah. Let me talk a little bit then about distribution and film costs for your films, especially the films that will play in theaters, your feature films, because you've done about 6 or 7 feature films. And so you got the idea for it, you cast for it. I would assume that most of the people that you hire are local actors, although I see in your Durant's Never Closes, you have Michelle Stafford, who's a well-known soap actress, and Tom Sizemore, who's done a lot of episodic TV and some films. So they're probably the biggest quote-unquote names that you have in some of your films. Uh, do so when you have the film here, do you yourself just start calling independent theaters, in Detroit, or Platt, or Boise, Idaho, and say, look, could you book me 2 or 3 weeks to run my film there? How do you get it out there, actually?
Well, that's still a difficult question. With Durant's, with our first films, I'll start there. We played them locally, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And sometimes we would have to four-wall this theatrical release, which means rent the theater, basically.
Yeah.
rent the theater, keep 100% of the profit. With Durant's, I was inspired by a filmmaker I spoke with during the distribution process. When I was looking for a traditional distributor and had some offers on the table, I would reach out to filmmakers who had worked with these companies. And a lot of times I heard horror stories. They took my film, they promised me this, 2 years later it hasn't even come out, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And this one guy had taken his movie and I believe had it played in at least 30 theaters just in the Midwest without four-walling a single one. I took some inspiration from him, and when we didn't have any good distribution offers for Durant's, I said, well, why should we go with a bad offer when we can take control in our own hands and get this movie out there? And what is the dream of most filmmakers? To get your movie played in as many theaters as you possibly can. So I just started calling what you would say are art house theaters around the country, and convincing them to play the film. And sometimes it would be for a week-long engagement, and other times it would be for a night, just a single night. Sometimes not even a Friday or Saturday night. In Chicago, it was a Monday night, and that's the best that they could do for me. And I took it because I felt that being played and getting that exposure was very important. And I actually, in order to pull this off, I had to be on the road, going to these places for a good 2 months, 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
So again, goes back to stability. And can you just uproot yourself and go on the road with this film for a couple months and just leave everything? And I think that's important if you're going to take control of your films, what your film's going to do. And I was able to get it played in, this weekend it'll play in its 23rd theater. And then it'll pretty much, its theatrical release will be done. But I think that, considering our film, the size of our film, the talent in our film, I don't know what other Tom Sizemore film has been played in that many theaters in the last 10 years, I'd say,
So I had mentioned last year I'd interviewed an indie filmmaker who made a $5,000 film. How much does a film like Durant's cost? Because does someone like a Sizemore or Michelle Stafford, who I said who's a fairly well-known soap actress, are these people who are doing this in terms of just to get their names out there? I mean, or how did you even contact people like them? Did you know them through Gus or people who he knew?
No, I had to hit up their agents, which was the first time that I had ever done something like that.
And you also had Peter Bogdanovich.
Yes, awesome. Yes. So all of these people, I went through their agents, except for Michelle, who was a contact of our executive producer. Mm-hmm. Michelle came in like 2 weeks before we started shooting. We still had not filled the female lead role. Mm-hmm. At one time, it was going to be played by an actress named Dina Meyer, who's in Starship Troopers and some other films. So I approached these agents. I'd never done it before. Traditionally, not necessarily what you do. You'd work through a casting director. I don't really have a casting director. For a while I had one, but he was not really experienced in terms of casting Hollywood talent. So I just did it myself. And I kind of learned the lessons as I went, and I had to definitely fudge the truth to get my foot in the door, because a lot of these agents don't want to talk to you unless, one, you have all your money, and two, you have a decent name, but I would fudge the truth to get my foot in the door, to get someone like Tom, and then I would use Tom to get Peter Bogdanovich and the others. And I got better at negotiating their salaries as I went. I think when I started out, you're not that good at that kind of thing. But I learned, okay, maybe we can pay these people less than it seems. But still, a good majority of the budget went to that talent, because though I believe in making movies for $5,000 or less, and we're about to make another one that I wrote, produced, and one of my team has directed for about that amount, obviously there's value in having so-called name talent, especially if you want your film to be distributed. And, you know, it may be Tom and Peter and those names that has opened the door to that theatrical release, and definitely it's opened the door to us having an international sales agent. So only time will tell if getting those people involved in spending the money that we did was worth it or not. But I think it was, and it was fun to work with Hollywood talent for the first time. It's a totally different experience than working with locals.
Yeah. So was it just? And again, I'm not the IRS, but I'm just for people who are interested in and young filmmakers too, who may 5 or 10 years down the line be following in your footsteps. Do you say to someone like Sizemore, well, we can't pay you, and I would assume you're non-SAG, right?
No, this was SAG.
Oh, it was.
You can't work with these people.
Oh, okay.
Without it being a SAG production, unless they're cheating, unless they're...
Okay, that was my other question. So you have to pay the SAG salary, the minimum at least, then?
Yeah, so there's like a, a day rate scale, right? Depending on what budget level you're on. But these people were not paid scale. I can't tell you what their salaries were, but they were offered not a day rate, but a salary for the production, right? And, there's different ways to do things. I mean...
And did they negotiate like a percentage of profit, perhaps?
Some of them, we talked about that. That's in some of their contracts, yeah. That's one thing you can use to maybe bring the cash amount down. It just depends on who you are. One of my heroes, John Sayles, who made a lot of independent American films, he, to my knowledge, on a lot of his productions, has had some of these actors on this level working for scale. But that's because he's John Sayles. He has a reputation and he has a relationship, and hopefully eventually we're able to do that kind of thing. But with this, like I said, to get our foot in the door, we had to offer an actual salary. The movie was made for around $250,000, which, in my opinion, is a quarter of what it would cost to make the same movie with the same talent in LA. Yeah. Because we spent less, I think, than they would have in LA. Or even someone here with a Hollywood mindset who just throws money at problems. So I still think that's a fairly low budget, but obviously it's a lot of money for independent filmmakers.
So does a guy like you or Gus, do you have to like take out a second mortgage to get that money initially, or do you go and have a dozen people who maybe put in 20 grand or something?
Right. Some of our original films were self-financed, I guess you could say. Yeah. But lately, we have been seeking investors for our project. And depending on the amount of, depending on the budget, these investors might be putting in anything from $1,000 if it's a $15K budget, or more than that if it's something like Durant's. So we had to step it up and take it to the next level and go find funding, which is absolutely the most difficult thing for filmmakers, period, on any level, including Spielberg. Funding is always the issue.
Yeah. Let me just ask a final question in this segment, and then I want to actually talk about the content of the films, the genres that you do, and whatnot. But I think it's been fascinating just talking about these nuts and bolts of the industry, because I rarely hear about this. One of the reasons I do these interviews is to try, especially dealing with the arts and acting and filmmaking, is that a lot of people just sort of get the idea that, oh, people just do it, but they don't realize what goes into it. How about, you had mentioned about the theatrical release. Is DVD or Netflix or some kind of streaming company? There's a company, I forget the name of it, that streams a lot of foreign films. It's got an odd name. My wife has watched some films on it. But are you looking to, for example, partner up perhaps with a streaming service that you could get some of your films on download, or do you pressing DVDs for them? What after the theatrical release is the afterlife of these films?
Well, as I told my investors originally, to my knowledge, there are three ways to make money off of a film. One, theatrical. Two, foreign sales. Selling your movie to international territories. And then also the third, VOD/DVD. Obviously, DVD has been on its way out for years now. We absolutely wanted to do VOD, video on demand, with our film Durant's and all of our films, and we worked. The direction that we decided to go was to work with a company called Distribber, because a lot of people will ask me, non-filmmakers will ask me, well, is the movie going to be on Netflix? And I think their conception is that you just call up Netflix or email them and say, hey, here's our movie. It doesn't work that way. You have to usually go through a middleman, so to speak. And that middleman might be your distributor, if you're with the Weinstein Company, right? Or in our case, because we don't have a domestic distributor, we went through a company called Distribber. And what Distribber does is that you basically pay them to get your film submitted to various VOD services, including Netflix. You pick your package. And I think they're much better than the festivals, because their deal is you pay them, and if it gets in, they keep the money, and if it doesn't, they give it back to you, which I think is a pretty good deal. I think that's what festivals should do. Yeah. So, a lot of people also don't understand this, but I've been advised that you should not start with Netflix when you do this kind of thing, because everyone has Netflix, and they pay you a lump sum, and that's it for however long. But we're going to start with iTunes and Amazon, and that launches at the end of next month. We're about to announce the release date this Saturday. So we're going to do sort of a staggered release. iTunes, Amazon, eventually, hopefully Amazon Prime, and then we'll see about Netflix. And we'll also probably do some of the smaller ones, like Vimeo. Which is a community of filmmakers, and maybe something like Fandor if they're interested.
That was the company Fandor. I couldn't think of that.
Yeah, Fandor is really cool. I just recently worked with a guy named Alex Cox, who directed a lot of great movies throughout the years, including some classics in the 80s, Repo Man and Sid and Nancy. A lot of his films are on Fandor. Yeah.
Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk about some of the films in general, and some specifics as well, the artistic side, since we've done the nuts and bolts, and we'll do that in a moment. Running Wild Films is the topic. Travis Mills is the founder and CEO of this independent film production company. Spent the first half of the interview talking about the founding of the company and some of the industry nuts and bolts stuff. I want to now talk a little bit about some of the films you have. Before I get to the feature films, I see that you had actually done a documentary about character actors, which is interesting since I recently started an actor interview series. I just did my 7th one yesterday, where I'm talking with mostly non-big name actors. I mean, I guess if George Clooney called up one day and wanted to be interviewed, I'd interview him. But I've always found it interesting that people will encounter acting and they have no clue that there's an art form behind it. And with the exception of pop music, it's the art form that we encounter most daily in life. You turn on a TV show, go to the movies, you're acting occasionally. Maybe 5% of people who actually go to plays. It is an art form that deserves some scrutiny. What are the things that you look for when you're casting some of your films? You said you used mostly local talent for most of your films. Do you have that sort of what European directors used to have, that steady stable of actors that you reuse, or do you use different people in each film?
Well, um, mostly we follow the pattern of what I think of as like the John Ford stock company
Yeah,
idea of having actors that you work with consistently in different projects, and you develop a relationship with these people and you grow together. I think there's a lot of value in that. There's also a lot of value in, about a year or two ago, I started to get into the work of Robert Bresson, a French
yeah,
filmmaker. And I find a lot of truth in what he says. First of all, he does not use any professional actors.
yeah,
He only uses people who aren't actors. And he only works with them, I think, with maybe a few exceptions, once.
yeah.
Because he doesn't want them to be comfortable or, necessarily fall into any sort of patterns. I found that very intriguing. And since then, I've been trying to change it up and embrace so-called non-actors more, because I think that you can get some very interesting performances out of people who are not professional actors. But I want to work with the entire spectrum. And, I was reading an interview with William Friedkin last night,
Yeah.
and he said something to the effect of what you want to look for most in an actor is intelligence, a thought process. It's not necessarily how well they read lines. It's, are they thinking about the script? Do they understand the subtext of the script? I started off not even doing traditional auditions, but just meeting actors at coffee shops and getting a sense of who they were. That's what I'm going back to after a couple of years doing these cattle call auditions, which can be helpful and I see the value in them, but I don't think it's the kind of method that I want to use anymore.
Hmm.
So anyway, I'm interested in actors or people who have an interesting thought process and are just kind of interesting individuals, period, and bring that to the film.
The actor I interviewed yesterday was telling me he did a film a few years ago with Ken Howard and Robert Duvall. He was a minor player in the film, and he said that there was one scene though where I guess Duvall was the bad guy, and once he gets exposed, there's about a 90-second shot of just looking at Duvall's face, and he doesn't say anything. And he said it was such a powerful scene that Ken Howard just started clapping and said bravo when it was done. And that's the kind of acting that you just don't see in Hollywood. It's all of this, superhero shit, and you don't get these Bresson like Oh Hussar Balthazar or Mouchette kind of films where
Right.
you're actually taking the time to watch something develop. One of the things I learned to appreciate when I got into foreign films about 10 years ago, watching the films of a Fellini or a Bergman or some more contemporary people like the Angelopouloses or the fellow who just retired, who did Satan Tango. I forget his name off the top of my head. But is that you will get these long scenes that play out. It's not just cut every third second, cut, or reaction shots. I enjoy seeing some of the Japanese masters when they'll have a master shot of two people in dialogue, and you'll see the whole thing, and the actors will act with their whole bodies. There's that a great scene in The Virgin Spring by Bergman where I think it's Max von Sydow. His daughter is dead, and he's by a brook, and you just see him from the back with his shoulders slumped. Uh, you don't see his face, but you get the anguish of the character just the way his body moves. Is that one of the things that I mean, when you're directing style, are you one of these sort of hyperkinetic, MTV generation directors, or do you mix it up what the story, what the scene entails?
Well, let me comment on something first. I think it's also important that that kind of filmmaking is not just found in foreign cinema, but also American cinema, specifically the early studio days.
Yeah.
You find the same stuff in the work of John Ford and Hawks and all of the great directors who've been forgotten, people like Joseph H. Lewis and all of those guys. They were, telling the story through pictures, not just shot, reverse shot, over the shoulder, cut to a close-up for no reason.
Yeah.
They would hold on a long shot for 5-6 minutes, then cut to a close-up, and it would be incredibly powerful when they did. So I think that in general that has been lost in American cinema, but it used to be. In terms of, I think it's one, I decided very early on that it's bad to have a style. And I think that being conscious of a style is one of the biggest problems with the American film scene, Hollywood and independent. That sort of the figures that are looked at as the successful independent directors who've become the establishment, people like Tarantino, Wes Anderson, are so conscious of their style that they're just making films that reflect this style instead of just telling a good story, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do that. I don't think that Ford and Hawks and all of these guys were conscious of their style. They just followed their instincts. So this means that I've done music videos, like one for a local band named Gorky called Dad Ass, which features, quick cuts of women shaking their asses, right? You know what I mean? In a humorous music video. And I've also done films such as in the 52 films where I'll experiment with, holding on a two-shot for 5-6 minutes, or shooting the movie entirely in close-up. The story dictates the style, is my rule. So I'm going to follow the story and my instincts about it and not be conscious of any sort of, direction of my career. I think it's bad to be even conscious of the pattern of your career.
Yeah. You'd mentioned some foreign directors that have caught your eye. When we talk about independent film in America, it basically starts with Orson Welles, then John Cassavetes, and then you mentioned John Sayles. They're sort of the Mount Rushmore of American indie film, truly indie film. Like you said, the Wes Andersons are sort of, they're sort of the faux. They may have started indie, but they're a long part of the establishment. What were you influenced by any of those big three directors? And if so, what lessons did you learn either on camera or off camera from their careers?
I think I learned most from those guys off camera, because it's essential for filmmakers, which a lot of the ones that I know do not do this, to read books about these guys and to read their own words. You have to dig deep into their interviews. Orson Welles, I watched an interview he did in Paris, which is just great, where he calls himself an amateur. This is someone who made what's considered by most to be the greatest film ever made, and here he is calling himself an amateur. There's a lot I've taken from his spirit for filmmaking, his inventiveness, whether he was at times a madman or not. I love that he was just willing to sort of do things in a very unconventional way with his later films that were sort of messy and not completely pieced together. Cassavetes, I also love his spirit, just to go out and do it. He had the spirit of the French New Wave to just make it happen. And a lot of people will complain to me with this attitude of, well, you should never work without getting paid. And I think that that's, frankly, bullshit. Cassavetes had people working with him for free his entire career, regardless of the fact that he's doing Hollywood stuff on the side, because they believed in the project. These actors were donating their time, or crew donating their time. They didn't get paid for these films that they were doing together. And Sayles, I just think is is just a fascinating filmmaker in the way that he has told these stories from different parts of the country and taken different parts of the U.S. and really explored the culture there. Alaska with Limbo, Florida with Sunshine State, Texas with Lone Star. I don't think people take his work seriously enough because he sort of is, in some ways, a modern John Ford. John Ford also explored American history and culture extensively. So I know I'm rambling, but I think that sales is really interesting. The other thing that's interesting about sales is that he used the system to finance his films. He wrote scripts and he sold scripts, B movies to Corman, and then he's written films for the big studios to finance his own movies. And they say do not invest in your own films, which he's totally gone against. And I think that's smart, and I take inspiration from that as well.
Yeah, Lone Star and Mate One are two really great films that he did. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but you can find it on YouTube, at least as of a year ago. Chimes at Midnight, or Falstaff, Wells's film from the late 60s. Terrific film, because he takes a character that one of Shakespeare's silliest, most ridiculous characters, who appears in 4 or 5 plays, threads them together, adds his own stuff, and it's a brilliant, brilliant film. I mean, and he filmed it over 7 or 8 years, and you just watch it, and it's like only Orson Welles could have done that. But anyway, let me talk about your film specifically. It looks like, just from the cover art and the titles and some of the descriptions of it, are most of them what would be called modern noir films? They seem to be sort of caper or heist kind of themes. Is that correct?
Well, even though I don't really like to look at the pattern of my work, I can't help but recently notice that I would consider all of my feature films to be, in some way, related to the mystery genre. Even our baseball movie that we made is about 2 retired baseball players who are secretively meeting for this private duel that they have on the baseball field. So it gets back to the idea of mystery. I think I'm just attracted to that. I love noir, and I love the crime genre. I'm very fascinated with that, and I just keep going back to it. That doesn't mean that I don't want to do anything else, but I recently finished a script that hopefully we'll be making next year that's it's set in the world of churches in the South. But even that, I said to my team when I sent it to them, I said, it's like a Hitchcock thriller set in the world of churches. So something keeps leading me back to crime in our work.
Yeah. You mentioned Hitchcock. Hitchcock famously, treated actors as sort of pawns to use. What kind of director are you? Are you what would be called an actor's director? I mean, if an actor came to you and said, wouldn't it be better if maybe I pause for 3 seconds here before speaking? Are you open to those kinds of suggestions in the moment, or do the actors have to hit the marks and whatnot regardless?
That's a complicated question. I am definitely not the traditional definition of an actor's director. I think the actors are very important. I don't have this great fondness for actors as some directors have. I mentioned recently working with Alex Cox, and he said, I was his casting director and associate producer for a new film, Tombstone Rashomon, and he said once, a room full of actors is a director's dream. And I thought, wow, that's my nightmare. Because actors are insecure and, very often complex and confused individuals. Many times this is why they're interesting on screen. I'm open to suggestions from actors, and I like to work with someone who's creative and who's bringing something new to the screen, who's really doing something with the character that I didn't realize could be done. Sizemore is a good example in our recent movie, Durance. A lot of people don't realize that much of the dialogue in the film is improvised, but it's not stupid improvisation. It comes from the subtext of the script. He understands the character, right? So what he would do was very interesting 90% of the time. And I would have to battle him sometimes to get him to do what I wanted. And I will be very specific with actors. You know, sometimes they'll make a suggestion and I'll say, no, that doesn't fit. Or I'll say, okay, sure, we'll do that. And then the next take, I'll get what I want out of it. The people I work with consider me to be a cruise director in the sense that I think I put more emphasis on my relationships with the director of photography and the rest of the crew. And I admire them more than I admire the actors, to be honest with you, because they're the ones that I think are working hardest on set, especially my sets where we really are working at a breakneck speed.
That was you anticipated my next question. I was going to ask because I know Stanley Kubrick famously controlled everything. You know, he could look at a scene and say that needs another whatever amount of lighting or whatnot. Well, I said the track has to be 18 inches from the end of the table, not 17.5. To what degree do you allow some freedom for your cinematographer or your sound people, or even you know, you have an interesting score for the trailer of Durant's. Do you know, how does the composer or whoever does your scoring, what kind of leeway do you give the behind the set people or behind the scenes people?
Well, to touch on that, I'd like to say that one of the hardest parts of filmmaking is collaboration. Like I said, I truly believe there should be one captain of the ship, but you also want thinking, creative people working with you, and I don't want to control every element. So, you know, a relationship I have with my cinematographer, one particularly, has developed over the course of several feature films, and it's I want to hear what he thinks, how he wants to light the scene, how he wants to shoot the scene. I'll share my ideas, he'll share his. Sometimes there's a compromise, sometimes it's, you know, somewhere in between. Other times I tell him, no, I want it this way. And you got to work with people who can take ownership of their job and be creative, suggest ideas, but also be willing to follow your lead and trust your lead. It's a very, very difficult process, I think, to find those kind of people that you can work with consistently without getting in conflict. But I do, absolutely, you know, I can't write the score, and I don't know how. And sometimes someone will, you know, Nick, my DP, will set up an angle that I never would have thought of, and it's way better than anything I would have thought of. So you got to be open to suggestions, and I think, again, the interview with Friedkin that I read last night, he said the best idea works. Whether it comes from the gaffer or the actor, you got to go with the best idea.
Yeah. You also, in the website, when I was reading up about it, talk about obstacles and overcoming them, and that's something that a lot of filmmakers have said over the years. And you did the 52 short films in 52 weeks for the intensity to learn, to get a good education. I heard you saying in an interview. What did you learn the most, say, in those 52 and 52 weeks? And give me an example of, say, an obstacle that you overcame that either monetarily or in terms of physically getting a shot that you came up with a creative solution for?
The biggest one would have been in week 4. We were shooting a movie called Nathaniel Hawthorne's Catastrophe, and it had a script with dialogue, and we live in Arizona where it rarely rains, but it rained that entire weekend. And in the film is set almost entirely with exteriors. I knew that we could shoot in the rain by bagging the camera, but I didn't think that we could record audio in the rain. So I turned the film into a silent picture and with intertitles. And I think it works really well, and some people who saw it think it's one of the best of the 52. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but that's an example of thinking on your feet. Yeah. And the 52 mostly taught me you have to think on your feet. You have to trust your instincts with this kind of filmmaking that we're doing. If an actor's giving you trouble, don't, and might sabotage the production, don't be afraid to fire that actor and replace them with another, or figure out a way to, delete the character from the script. You gotta do that. And I think some of the stuff we've done, like Durant's, would not have been possible without the 52, because with Durant's we had to really think on our feet a lot of the time of how we're going to pull this off at the last second.
Yeah, I know that's one of the things a lot of young artists have a problem with, and I get this all the time with writers. They always want to say something, and I've always said that to me the best art that I find generally, at least in writing, is organic, comes organically. I say, if you want to write a story about how you found a little puppy when you were 7 and what it meant to you, and it turns out that the real story that you're trying to tell is about the Nazi invasion of Poland, go with the Nazis. You can always go back to the puppy and tell that story in another venue, another time. Go with what works, because there's something, there's something inside of you, the unconscious or the subconscious, which is dictating that this is what you should be focused on. But people, there's this, I guess, in society, there's the zeitgeist that I must say something. I have to have something important to say, rather than going with what is working and then enjoying the adventure of, oh, I started out at A, but I ended up at Q, and Q is better than what A would have been.
Yeah.
Let me.
I think
Yeah, go
that
ahead.
I think that people don't understand this idea that, trying to having any kind of message with your work is the wrong way to go about it. Again, it goes back to story, and if some message is conveyed through the story, great, but don't be didactic about it. And again, they don't. It's because they don't study film. They don't go back to the masters and see that they never had a message with their work. And like you said, you got to be flexible to let the project develop on its own. It will create. It will have a life of its own, and the director just needs to be able to sort of guide it along and not let it get off course, but also be willing to say, okay, well, the wind is going to blow us this way, and I think that we should let it.
You have a couple of other series that looks like 100 crime films, and then 12 westerns in 12 months. Is the 12 westerns, is that something you're going to be doing in the next year or two?
The 12 westerns is probably the most ambitious project that I can conceive of at this time, because I want to do 12 feature-length westerns in 1 year, so one a month.
And would they all be directed by you, or half by Gus and half by you?
I would like to direct all of them at this point, because I think mainly because I want to show that making 12 movies in a year is not weird, and that it's possible. Not that it's some great feat, but that, hey, look, this is not that weird. It's not. It's actually much more, sort of odd, in my opinion, to only make one movie every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
So it's in development. Obviously, to do something like that is on such a big scale. It's going to require a decent amount of funding, and we just have to be consistent and believe that the project's going to come together eventually. We're working on the scripts, doing readings of the scripts, even public readings for audiences.
And are they all scripted by you, or are these people that you work with that have?
A few of the projects, Gus is writing one of the westerns, and I had a woman named Brenda, an actress and writer in Arizona, collaborating with me on one of the scripts. I'm open to other people's scripts, absolutely, because I do not insist on writing everything that I direct.
And let me just ask, since you've done adaptations of classic short stories, are you open to, like, let's say, 5 or 10 years down the line, are you open to adaptations of, say, a popular novel or something, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, one of our properties right now that we have is not a current popular novel, but it's a short story by Lawrence Block, who's a famous mystery writer.
Yeah.
So I love using literature, current or past, to create movies. Absolutely. Obviously, we don't have the funds right now to option some of the, some of the properties that are hottest, so to speak. And if they're hottest, I probably wouldn't be interested in them, because that means that usually whatever is the most popular is also has the least value, because it rises to the surface.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, even some of the some of the 12 westerns are based on sources. One of them is based on the story "The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky," and then another one is sort of loosely based on Hamlet.
The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky. I know there was a Western in the late 40s. I don't know if you ever saw it, called Yellow Sky. I'm just wondering if that's the same thing. Is this about some guys who rob a bank and they're in the desert and they come upon a ghost town?
Yellow Sky,
Because that was a Gregory Peck film.
I believe, is actually, I might be totally wrong about this, but I thought that Yellow Sky is inspired by The Tempest,
Okay.
another Shakespeare play. And
Okay.
Bride Comes to Yellow Sky is an interesting short story about a sleepy town and this sheriff who's bringing back this his new wife, and it's sort of taming him and civilizing him, and he has this ongoing sort of battle that happens in the town with this drunk gunfighter, and it's about the death of the West, so to speak. So it's a really interesting short story, and we're trying to do something like a very black comedy direction for it.
Yeah, about 6, 7 months ago, I interviewed a young woman who's only 21. She's an independent filmmaker too. She's based in Canada. Her father was a filmmaker in Argentina, and she's done a handful of short films. I think she did one 60, 65-minute film, and it was interesting when I watched her films online, her short films. I could see influences in, but when I asked her, it's clear that I said, it's clear you watched some Billy Wilder comedies, some screwball comedies from the 30s or 40s, even some silent era film techniques. And she told me, no, she had no idea of some of the people I was talking about. Some of them were sort of like almost Twilight Zone episodes, and she said she'd never even seen the original Twilight Zone. She's only 21, but she described that she had seen this person who was influenced by this person who was influenced by this one, who was influenced by Billy Wilder or Rod Serling. I'm wondering, have you noticed, for example, in your own films, things that have crept out that you said, that reminds me of so-and-so, and yet I until someone pointed it out, I never really made that connection?
I try not to analyze my own work because I think it's a mistake to be too conscious of your own work. Occasionally that'll happen when someone else looks at it. Specifically, someone like Gus, who knows film, will look at something we've done after it's been completed and say, well, you've made a chamber piece here, or compare it to a specific director. And then I'll think, that's true. And I was not conscious of it at all. So I try not to be conscious of those influences and set out to make a Hawks-like picture.
Yeah.
A director that I have some admiration for him, but I also have a lot of issues with his work. Brian De Palma seems like so often he's trying to make a Hitchcock picture. I think it's a mistake. Let those influences just come out naturally. That's the same thing as having a message. So, but at the same time, that girl who's making Twilight Zone-like work but has never seen Twilight Zone, the problem is like you said, she's working off of a string of influences, and I think it's good to be conscious of where all these things came from.
Now, let me just ask a final question here, and then we'll wrap up the interview, and I'll ask you about the future that you see. But do you, since you have clearly put yourself at a certain pace with some of the short films and this Western project, does a filmmaker like Woody Allen, who's done basically a film a year for almost half a century now, Do you admire that kind of thing? Because some of the downside of that is, although he has, maybe 12 or 15 films you could argue are great, he's also had a lot of things that are just sort of lesser, repetitive, lesser iterations of some of his better work. Do you think that there's a burnout factor if you go too much too soon?
You know what? It's certainly possible that you could burn out, but Woody Allen's one of my heroes for how prolific he is. And I think he's doing it right because he just makes the films. He doesn't know what's going to be a hit or not. He doesn't know what's going to turn out well or not. Some of his favorites of his own work were some of his biggest flops, you know? You don't know. And I think it's bad to sit around and contemplate it and think about it. You know, someone like Quentin Tarantino takes years to come out with a new film, and then sometimes it's just total shit, you know, and it feels so self-conscious. I admire filmmakers like Kubrick, who took a long time. Obviously, his work is great, but I relate most to the guys like Woody Allen or someone like Michael Curtiz, who back in the studio days, they said made an average of 3 pictures a year.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to turn out well. And like I said, I don't really think of myself as an artist, but a craftsman, or even an athlete. I'm just playing games and playing them as best as I can.
Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, I'll give you a few closing remarks, so we'll do that in a moment. I have spoke with Travis Mills. He is the founder of Running Wild Films, an independent film company in Arizona. Let me just ask one question before I wrap it up. You said most of your films are either consciously or unconsciously set in Arizona. If, say, 5 or 10 years down the line, there comes a bigger income of funding, do you think that you will be maybe going down to Mexico to shoot, or up to Idaho, or over to do some film noir in Chicago or anything, or do you want to actually consciously stay within that little sphere? There are some filmmakers and some artists who, like James Joyce, wrote only about Ireland or Dublin area. Do you want to be known as the Arizona filmmaker?
The simple answer is no, and I'm already, expanding past that because we made a film in Mississippi in March. That's our latest film, Forges and Private Eyes, and it's coming out in September. And right after that, we'll be making another film in something I'm producing in Mississippi. Then I'll go produce something in Colorado. The Arizona connection is very important to me. And developing film here is definitely one of my goals. But I think that I want to do that all over the country. Again, I really like what Sales has done, where he's explored different areas of the country, and I'd like to do that nationally and internationally. I was born overseas, and a good deal of my childhood was spent overseas. Eventually, I'd like to end up back in Africa making movies if I live long enough. So, you can't be limited. I think people like Joyce and Faulkner, who stayed in Mississippi for the most part, are great. And I want to explore Arizona history and Arizona culture, but I'm interested in so many things. And also, I'm going to go where I'm treated best. A friend of mine who's an entrepreneur, Andrew Henderson, said, go where you're treated best. Well, right now we're treated best in Mississippi, so we're going to keep making movies there while we continue to develop cinema in Arizona.
I just a question that I had forgotten to ask earlier. Are you against? I'm not big on the arts granting system, but if, let's say, the state of Arizona came to you, or if someone said, you could apply and get, $200,000 from the state of Arizona, would you want to take that money, or would you be afraid that there would be strings attached, perhaps?
Honestly, in this world, because film is a business and has always been a business, there are always strings attached. I watched a recent documentary called Bill Cunningham, New York, about the famous fashion photographer, and it was very inspirational. And he said, if they pay you, they can tell you what to do. If they don't pay you, they can't tell you what to do. Well, there's always strings attached, whether it's investors or grants. And I think it's good to be conscious of that. You know, some filmmakers are making movies for the big studios, and they seem to have some kind of attitude that they're going to be able to do whatever they want and have final cut. And it's like, be realistic, man. They're giving you $60 million. Of course they're going to be calling the shots, you know? So I'm totally open to anything, you know what I mean? Government-funded films, state-funded films. That would be interesting. It would be interesting to work on a commission basis, which doesn't really happen much anymore.
And if you ever did get offered to do like something in Hollywood, would you go with the Cassavetes method of doing a project in Hollywood and then the next year using the money you made there to do your own stuff?
Yeah, or the sales method, like we mentioned, where he used his salary to fund his own films. If I was offered a payday in Hollywood, I would take it to further our independent work. I admire a director named Nicholas Winding Refn, who had a big hit with Drive and had the opportunity to make big, you know, multi-million-dollar Hollywood movies, and has since then followed up to not still big budgeted films compared to what I do, but he's making movies around the $4 or $5 million range because he wants to maintain some kind of level of creative control. And ideally, I think that's where I'd like to be, is you know, working at a higher level. But I'm not interested in, you know, going from making a $1 million movie to being hired to doing some kind of big budget blockbuster for $60 million to $100 million. It would be a nice payday, but again, you have to be aware that you lose a lot of your creative freedom.
Yeah. You look like you're 30-ish or so. Where do you hope to be, say, at the age of 50 with both your art and the business end?
I don't know if I'm going to be alive at 50. I don't think that far ahead. You know, it's a very weird time to be a filmmaker. And my main goal is to be sustainable, meaning that our projects are making money and that we're not constantly worried about getting money for more projects. I want it to be consistent, that we're getting consistent funding from one film to the next because they're making some kind of money and they're achieving some kind of success. That's my main goal, just to be consistent and sustainable. I don't have any aspirations for being an Oscar-winning filmmaker or being famous, so to speak. I think that we're entering a time, because so many people can make movies now and put them on YouTube, we're actually entering, my prediction is that it's going to be an era when there are people making movies who will perhaps spend their entire lives making movies and receive no great recognition for it, in the same way that painters of the past would paint their entire lives and receive no great recognition for it, and that this work will be discovered after the fact. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen with my career. I can't predict it, but I think that we're entering that era. No one's saying that, but that's what I feel.
Yeah, I have the exact same thoughts about writing. Everyone wants to express something. There's so much stuff on there. It'll take what they call cyber archaeologists in 2100 or something to look back and say, oh, how did they not publish this great book or this great whatever. But I want to thank you for your time. RunningWildFilms.com is Travis's website, and the name of his company is Running Wild Films. So if you've enjoyed this interview, check it out. And I guess in the next few months or so, the films will be available at certain streaming websites as well. So again, thanks for your time, Travis.
Thank you. I appreciate it.